And joining us now, Laura Stephenson. She is a political science professor at the University of Western Ontario and the author of Why Citizens Said No, a study she did on the referendum that took place in the '07 Ontario election for the Institute for Research in Public Policy. Thanks for being here tonight.
You're welcome.
Here's what the question that Ontarians had a chance to render their verdict on was back in 2007. Which electoral system should Ontario use to elect members to the provincial legislature? And they were offered two choices. The existing first-past-the-post system got an overwhelming number of votes, 63+%. The alternative electoral system proposed by the Citizens' Assembly, that was called MMP, mixed member proportional, a little bit confusing, almost 37%. For the referendum to pass, it required the majority of votes in the majority of ridings, plus a 60% overall yes vote. It was a very high threshold to meet, and only 5 of 107 ridings did vote yes. So the new system was overwhelmingly rejected. You co-authored a report about this, and I guess I want to start by asking, what interested you about this exercise to begin with?
Well, electoral reform is kind of one of those hot topics that is being discussed. Among political scientists, clearly. But across the country, we've been seeing a lot of talk in different provinces about it, and certainly the Law Commission of Canada had a report that came out and that was talking about mixed member proportional for the country as a whole. Certainly New Zealand experienced a change in the 90s. And so the talk about electoral reform is just one of those things people think of, well, you know, can we change it? Should we change it? And other places have, and I think it's been discussed here because we have the first-past-the-post system. And the first-past-the-post system is the one that creates the most disproportionate outcomes, or has the potential to. And so it's a very interesting case. And what's even more interesting is that the vote was put to the citizens. So instead of just being the government deciding, yes, we're going to do this, you know, now this is, well, what do the citizens actually think about this issue? Because it's not really a simple issue. And so we thought, well, this is a good thing to analyze.
It was very confusing, and you have done a report on it. And I wonder, we're going to show a couple of graphs here that, you know, basically put into number what everybody knows, which is federal and provincial participation in elections looks like a ski slope. I mean, it's just down, down, down. Between 1945 and 2008, you can see that line going down, and that's federally, and then again in Ontario with you know, a modest blip up in the middle there. Again, we seem to be at kind of record low participation levels. Mm-hmm. I guess the McGuinty government looked at these numbers and concluded there is a democratic deficit. Were they right to conclude that from those numbers?
Well, I think that it's a fair assessment that we are having these kinds of sentiments, not just in Ontario, across the country, right? And it's not just voter turnout being low, it's also distrust of government, lack of involvement. Certainly the youth are tuned out, as some scholars put it. And so there's this idea that people really aren't paying attention or taking part in their own government. What are we going to do about it?
And a referendum seemed like a good idea because?
Well, see, the referendum wasn't their only idea, right? They had a whole platform of ideas that were put forward that actually came out of their own party workings that had happened prior to the 2003 election. And the voters deciding on an electoral system was one part of it. And the referendum was actually, again, a choice of the voters because they created a citizens' assembly. So they had 103 average Ontarians meeting together to decide, do we need to change our electoral system or not? And they were the ones who decided, yes, we like MMP, and should we have put MMP to a vote as compared to the status quo? Yes, we should. So the referendum came out of that. And so it wasn't necessarily, I think, McGuinty saying, you know, let's do the referendum. He was just open to the idea.
Gotcha. Here's an excerpt from your report. Had the campaign been more informative, the issue publicized more, and the public more attentive or interested, the outcome might have been different. We talked about the outcome earlier. It was overwhelmingly rejected, this new proportional representation type of system that was suggested. How could more awareness have changed the results in your view?
Well, I think here goes back to your question about McGuinty and the democratic deficit. I think the issue in Ontario was that not a lot of citizens were terribly interested in what was going on. So while we find that, you know, there is some cynicism, there is some distrust of government, et cetera, there wasn't this overwhelming cry for more proportional system, more fairness, et cetera. And I think that is at the root of the problem with the referendum not passing, because the idea was put forward, and there were lots of very educated people on the pro and con side side of the actual MMP system. But for the citizens themselves, if they want change, they have to understand what the change is going to bring, and they have to make all those links with their own cynicism of distrust of government. And I don't think that happened. And I don't think the citizens were either informed enough or interested enough in the Citizens Assembly process to even pay attention to it. So when the referendum came along, people were saying, why do I get this extra ballot? Like, they didn't even know what to do with it, right? And that's a failure of information and probably a failure of interest as well.
So, okay, admittedly, first past the post gets you some distorted results. You can get 75% of the seats with 38% of the vote. That kind of thing happens. Members of the provincial legislature or the federal parliament can win their seats getting 34% of the votes in a riding. So these kinds of things happen. But what you found was, I just want to make sure I got this right, what you found was, in spite of all that, there's no overwhelming desire by the population to get rid of it?
We did not find a really strong sense in the survey data that we have. We found a bare majority was interested in a more proportional system. So in fact, they believe that, if you win about 40% of the vote, you should get about 40% of the seats. But in terms of getting rid of the first past the post system, we did not find a majority who felt that the weird outcomes of first past the post were actually unacceptable.
So when supporters of proportional representation say that with a more visible referendum, more publicity perhaps by the government, a stronger education campaign, more attention paid to the whole issue, their side would have won, you're saying,
I'm not so sure, because I think the interest needed to be there. And one of the things is, as people who work with survey data, we can play with the numbers and we can look at and create what-if scenarios, and we can see what would come out of that. But I think the issue is we don't really know where the interest lies. And so in our study, right, even if we look at what if everyone had felt fully informed about mixed member proportional, it still wouldn't have passed. And that's looking at one type of information. But the bigger thing would be, what if everyone was really interested and understood that everything they hate about government could partially be fixed by this, right? And what if they had those kinds of calculations? If those existed, I think there would have been a real chance.
But part of the problem, I gather, with MMP was no one could really explain it. It was really hard to explain. And your premise, the way you set it up a few moments ago, is absolutely right. They had the Citizens Assembly that, Mr. and Mrs. Everyday Ontario come together. They went to they went to hearings, rather. I mean, the whole thing took place, was very transparent. It was all online. I know we were very much involved with it. But at the end of the day, it was hard to explain that new system. Is that one of the reasons also why it failed? See,
actually, I think it was a lot easier to explain that than the one in BC. The single transferable vote, I've tried to teach it before, and it's a little more tricky to get that across, but certainly I think mixed member proportional isn't what we're used to, and it is certainly more complex than our system. I think our system is one of the most basic out there. Part of the issue with mixed member proportional is that it has to be complex in order to get at all the different objectives that people want to accomplish. So the Ontario Citizens Assembly had very specific objectives that they wanted to do. And in order to get those to work, they had to add different features of MMP, right? And the complexity and the potential consequences of those features are sometimes a little more difficult to understand.
You had members who didn't represent a riding, who were potentially going to sit in the legislature, which may be why so many of the existing MPPs had no interest in the thing. Because they didn't like it either. Well, except for the New Democrats, but they didn't like it either, did they?
Well, they weren't coming in clearly. That was certainly one argument against it. That there'd be MPPs without ridings. On the other hand, that's how you get proportionality.
Yes, it is.
Right.
Let's try this. What's in it for the big parties to change the electoral system when the most likely outcome of a more proportional representation type of system is that they suffer more and the little parties gain more?
So what's in it in changing the electoral system?
What's in it for the big parties to make that change?
Yeah, pretty much nothing.
Pretty much nothing, right. And yet they're the ones who are being expected to bring it in.
Well, you see, that's interesting. I mean, they would have to bring it in, I guess, if there was overwhelming demand. The only thing I could see would be that in McGuinty's case, right, it was part of this program that he was putting forward. We're going to do government differently. We're going to address these concerns of the citizens. And so they react that way. So you'd get some popularity from that. I mean, it is possible, theoretically, to have a majority government, although it's highly unlikely in an MMP system.
Did the McGuinty government, in your view, make a mistake when it went through this whole process of setting up the Citizens Assembly? They came up with this new recommended system, but the government never actually endorsed it. And in fact, even the minister in charge, I don't think, endorsed it. They had everybody just say, here it is, it's out there, you know, vote up or down as you like, but we don't have an official opinion on that. Was that a mistake?
I don't think on their part it was.
I don't mean in terms of crass politics. I mean, if you really wanted to give the thing kind of legs and...
I don't think so, because I think if you come out, you know, fully endorsing something, then you might have people voting for it simply because they adhere to the party or something like that. And this really isn't that much of a partisan issue. I mean, in partisan politics, anyone who is a supporter of either the Liberals or the PCs would say, no, we don't want that because our guys won't win as often, right? So I think they're going to make those calculations on their own to some extent as well. So I don't really think it was a mistake of the Liberals not to support it.
So admittedly, a speculative question here, but even if the government had endorsed it and the Conservative opposition had endorsed it, in other words, arguing against what's in their own self-interest,
right.
Do you think it would have done any better?
Well, yeah, actually I do.
It would have done better.
I do, because in those cases, I think then you have parties telling voters, hey, we support it, you should too. Right? And so then you have the parties providing some cues for the voters, and the voters were paying attention to what the parties said. And so that would give them a little bit of an idea, and I think that would have given an edge to the campaign.
A very high threshold, though, right? They had to get a majority of the votes in a majority of the ridings and 60% overall.
It's 60% overall and 60% in 50% of the ridings. So it's even higher, yeah. So, I mean, that's pretty, it's pretty high, that's for sure.
Was it fair to set the bar that high?
It's the same bar that was set in BC, and I think having this version of a supermajority, I think it is fair, because this isn't a simple little decision. It's a big one, and you know, you want to make sure that the public's behind it.
Can you say, I mean, some people, I'm sure the people who are in favor of PR will say that because this referendum didn't pass, the status of democracy in Ontario is more precarious today as a result. Would you go that far?
No, I wouldn't. And you know, really, we had a referendum, which is a form of direct democracy, and the citizens voted and had their say. So if anything, we should say that, you know, democracy has spoken, the people have spoken.
Except those who wanted this said it wasn't a fair fight.
Right, and that's, I think, a different issue altogether. I mean, there's one thing to attack democracy and the workings of democracy, and it's another thing to say that this question wasn't set up correctly or there wasn't enough information and stuff like that, because in one case you're talking about the context, in another case you're talking about the actual process. I think the process was very democratic, and it's unfortunate that with so much lack of interest or so much disinterest that it really came down to the type of information that was out there that swayed people. And I think in this case, yeah, there was a really poor campaign. So
this happened 2+ years ago. Should that be it? Should Ontario try this again, or is that it?
I think it should be it for quite a while.
Yeah?
Yeah. You know, we really need to see the citizens wanting change before they go about trying to get change. Right? I mean, it was a government initiative to go forward with this. And so, you know, they did their due diligence, they put together the big process, they came up with the idea, they held the referendum, but the citizens weren't overwhelmingly clamoring for this. You know, and I think you can tell that just with how many people didn't know. And even though the campaigns for on the pro and the con side, you know, the vote for MMP, there was a real discrepancy in terms of even the funds they had to campaign. And so the fact that the no side carried the day when I think they were less funded suggests that, you know, there was really not a lot of overwhelming or underlying support that would work in favor of it. You have to, I mean, it would be a pretty cold day in the middle of July for people to be taking placards to the middle of Yonge and Bloor screaming that we get rid of first past the post, right? This is just not the kind of thing people are going to storm the barricades over, is it? Not really. Not really. Okay, on that we agree. Laura, it's good of you to join us at TVO tonight. More information about your studies available on our website, and thanks for visiting us at TVO. Thank you.